Yeah.
So I will welcome you all and welcome any public participation. This is held under the open meeting laws, formally officially posted, and public is welcome to participate. Any announcements? Hearing none, let's move directly to the second bullet in our agenda, which is the progress and next steps on the survey of Gravelly Pond groundwater. I think for this, I will pass the microphone to Scott Horsley and Dana Trislow.
Thanks, Steve, and I'll start very briefly. Dana has prepared a draft final report on our thermal survey, which I'm going to ask her to summarize tonight for you, and we provided a copy of that. I do want to call out again, very sincere thanks to Jeff Copeland, to Nate and Chuck, who really, you know, we didn't even ask them. They just kind of showed up, which was pretty amazing. And, you know, so they've really added a lot to this, and really appreciate the work we're all doing together here. It's been really meaningful to me, and I think we're making some progress. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask Dana to give us a brief presentation, and Steve, with your permission, I don't know where you want to take it, but I do have a brief update on a conversation that I had with Francis Cardle as well on some of the water quality issues. Maybe we take that up under the specific group meetings. I'll leave that up to you, but let me go to Dana. Dana, you're here somewhere. I saw you earlier.
I am here.
There you are. Good to hear.
Yeah. Yep. So, okay, I'll give a broad-based summary of what was done out of the pond and what our results have been so far. So you recall that we did a field walk with the water department on the 14th, and not too long after that, we started the field survey. We continued the work on the 19th, and then Jeff Koshian, am I saying your name right, Jeff? I'm sorry if I did not.
Yes, Jeff Koshian.
Koshian. Really wonderfully volunteered to help us not only with the field work on the 19th, but then he picked up the ball and did some additional field measurements after that. So a number of points were done up until the 26th of September. So I'm going to present that full spectrum of work. You got a report which summarizes that information, and then if you really want to dig into the data, there's also an appendix which isn't part of the official report, but if you want more information, you're free to go through that and, you know, get back to me with any questions. So let me share my screen, and I'm going to just show a few slides that summarize what was done. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Here, okay, great. So this is just a very broad brush schematic of Gravelly Pond with the field measurement points that we made. There were multiple measurements made at most locations, so this really only represents, you know, a fairly small area of the actual data that was collected. But if you remember from our presentation in early September, what our original thought was that we would look at the contrast between the groundwater temperatures and the pond temperatures. And we took all those measurements through most of the sampling. There were some places where we just measured the temperature of the groundwater. I'm calling it the pore water in the report, just because when we're taking those measurements beneath the pond, where, you know, it could be a mix of pond water and groundwater, but for all intents and purposes, we're measuring groundwater temperatures. And what we decided after looking at the data, especially because measurements were collected over several days and the temperature of the air changed, which could have some impact on the temperature of the pond, that we're plotting up the pore water temperatures, that is the temperature of the groundwater, rather than the contrast between the water and the pond water and the pore water. So if you look on the right-hand side of this figure, you'll see a key with different colors that shows you the range of temperatures that we measured. The coolest temperatures being the light blue, the medium blue, and then as you get warmer, all the way up to red. So the coolest temperatures that were measured were clearly on the east side of the pond in areas that we call GP1, GP1A, and GP1B. We had measured temperatures of about 12 degrees to about 15 degrees Celsius in these particular locations. The temperature was cooler, but not as cool at GP3A, which is near the causeway west of the pumping station. And there's a large wetland and inflow area just southwest of here. So there's probably some groundwater contribution from that area as well. The other areas you see, the reds at GP3 and GP4, we had very warm temperatures in the shallow pore water areas here, and slightly cooler temperatures at 2B and 5. So the bottom line is that, you know, we're really getting, we feel, a lot of contribution from this eastern side of the pond, a little bit from this inflow area to the southwest, but lots of attention on this area here. The other thing that was observed in the field was that there was a real difference in the type of materials that we were finding in that shallow zone, a sandy, gravelly material that was not the typical very dense, gravelly material that we found in other parts of the pond. So I think that also points to the fact that we're intercepting that aquifer material in these areas. I'm just going to scroll down to the table just to give you, sort of the background on everything that was found. And again, we're looking at the whole range of measurements that were made, and we picked out the coolest temperatures at each location. So that's what's really highlighted in the figure and in this table here. So not every temperature was that cool, but the preponderance of data in most locations was closer to this temperature than to other temperatures. Because there were multiple temperatures taken at many locations in many different areas, either in the pond or just inland from the pond, averaging each point didn't really make sense. So that's why the coolest temperature was chosen, just to kind of give you an illustration of the range of temperatures that we found. So before I move on to water quality, does anyone have questions about the data that's been presented so far?
Hey, Dana, I just want to jump in here and remind people the relationship between coolest temperatures and our interpretation of groundwater discharge. Our interpretation is that the cooler areas represent the greatest areas of groundwater discharge, because that was the original question you asked us. Where is the groundwater? Where is the water coming from that goes to Gravelly Pond? And what I think this is suggesting is that the GP1, 1A, and 1B area seems to be the biggest groundwater contribution. Is that fair, Dana?
Yeah, that's totally the take-home message here. And from Jeff's observations too, and he made very detailed observations in addition to taking measurements. that he also would agree that there appears to be a fair amount of groundwater contribution in this area from the field observations that were made.
Can I say one thing? This is Jeff, sorry. A couple things. Informally, I went all the way around the pond and sampled everywhere around the pond, like every 100 feet or 200 feet or 300 feet or something. So I didn't bother to make official data points where it was clearly warmer, and it was warm all the way around. I didn't see anywhere other than GP1 that was cool. So that's just one point, is everywhere around the pond was informally sampled. And another thing that I feel, my amateur impression, is that the water seemingly seeping in around GP1 doesn't seem, by my just gut feel, to be enough to fill up or keep the pond full. So my gut feeling is that, and I'm open to being corrected, is that there must be water coming in at a deeper level toward the middle of the pond somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So Jeff, I'll just jump in on that. I think your intuition is exactly right on both counts. We haven't measured in the middle of the pond, but clearly there is discharge here as well. But I think, given what I've learned about the history from many reports provided by Nate and Chuck, and talking with you and others, that the groundwater discharge to Gravelly Pond is not enough to provide the supply required, which is the reason why I think that the round pond wells were established to supplement that supply. So I just want to say I would agree on both accounts what you're saying.
Excellent. Can we move on to water quality measurements?
Sure. So while we were there on the 14th, and the decision was made before we did our field work, that it would make sense to look at some water quality of the shallow pore water in the GP1 area, because we knew that the monitoring of the Hamilton landfill showed that there's some groundwater impairment from the landfill. So if this is an inflow area, then this might be a good place to get a sense of what the water quality is in the shallow zone. That could be a contribution from the Hamilton landfill. So while we were out there in the area at GP1 and just north of GP1 in a small cove area, using a stainless steel probe, which basically went to 3.5 feet, we were able to extract enough groundwater to take a sample using some field measured parameter data. And I'm going to scroll down to that table that summarizes that information. So the three measurements were taken there: electrical conductivity, pH, and dissolved oxygen. And conductivity is a representation of the amount of dissolved ions in water. So, for instance, if you have water softeners, or if you have salt dissolved in water, you're going to have a high ionic strength, because all those salts separate into their component parts, which allows electricity to travel or be transmitted through the water. So the electrical conductivity measurements gives you a sense of ionic strength. Now, on the scheme of things compared to seawater, this conductivity, really is not anywhere close to seawater. So in terms of comparing it to saltwater, this is very low. But in my experience, in unimpacted areas, the conductivity that we usually see in freshwater is less than 100 microsiemens per centimeter. That's the measurement that's made when you do conductivity measurements. And so these are higher, the measurements that we made were higher than typical background in a freshwater area that isn't, you know, highly saline. And so there's appears to be some ionic impact. I did talk to Ben at the water treatment plant to see if they took conductivity measurements of the pond inflow or the discharge water from the settling ponds, and he does not take that measurement. But they do measure pH, and the pH that they get is typically a little higher than what I measured. But this is not an unusual pH for freshwater, the 6 to 6.5 range. And then dissolved oxygen is kind of interesting because it really tells you how much activity there is, interchange with the atmosphere for the most part. So the first sample looked like there was very high dissolved oxygen, whereas these pore water samples, which are, you know, 3 to 3.5 feet below the surface, they didn't have as much oxygen in them, which is pretty typical, but these levels are closer to what you might see in a wetland situation where there's a lot of decomposition going on, and that oxygen is being taken out of the water. But we are in sort of a wetland here anyway, so I don't think that's indicative of any offsite influences. But the conductivity could indicate some offsite impacts. And looking upstream, you know, the closest possible impact is the Hamilton landfill. So there's nothing that is, you know, 100% convincing here, but it does suggest that there's some impact from an offsite source here.
Great. Any questions or comments from the task force?
Dan, I just question is the difference between the 0.93 DO sample and the 9.95 sample, is that because of interaction with the atmosphere only, or are there other reasons?
It's probably more interaction than anything else. It's just closer to the surface, and it's out of an area where there's decomposition happening. So if I was to take a pore water sample, you know, on the shoreline, well away from a wetland area, as long as there weren't any other waste site impacts, you would probably get a fairly high dissolved oxygen level. It might not be 9.95, but 6.17, anywhere from 6 to 8 is pretty typical for shallow groundwater that's not impacted.
Okay, thank you.
And just to follow up on that, Dan, at what level of dissolved oxygen would you begin to suspect that there's it's the influence of some contaminants?
Well, dissolved oxygen is a tricky one because it can be a natural impact as well as a man-made impact. So just decomposing leaves and, you know, organic materials like in the bottom of a pond. You might take a sample at the bottom of a typical pond or lake and find it had a very low dissolved oxygen because you've got lots of organic material building up, decomposing, sucking that oxygen out of the water in order to, you know, process the decomposition process. So it's a concern for water quality in terms of biological life in a pond, but you can't necessarily point your finger at a source with low dissolved oxygen.
Understand, thank you. And would the samples you took, could they usefully be tested directly for levels of things like sodium or metals?
They could be if they were, if they were kept. Usually you want, when you take a sample like that, it's often better to isolate it from the area using, if you have a well, you can isolate it from other influence sources. But because I was using a very small diameter sampling probe, I think I was getting water from a very localized source. So, had more sample been taken, it could have been taken to a lab and you could get some reasonable samples from it.
Good. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. I notice Nate and Lynn Atkinson have their hands up. Oh, just Nate now. So Nate, go ahead, unmute and tell us.
Yep. So you noted that we do that the monitoring well there was sampled next to the filter effluent lagoon. And I know you'd asked Ben about if we monitor that conductivity. I think it can safely be assumed that it's generally going to have a higher conductivity, going to that, because it is the filter backwash and it's, basically taking out all the impurities and sending it to the lagoon. Do you think that has an influence on the higher conductivity of the pore water sample there, or could it influence it?
I don't think it would have that much influence on it, but it's difficult to say. I mean, if we look at, I'm going to scroll back up to the map. So this purple arrow here is roughly where the discharge occurs from these settling ponds here.
Yep.
And the sample was taken just north of there, and it was in the shallow groundwater. So the reason I asked for that was just as a comparison to, what you're getting from the pond or what's going into the pond. So if it was close to what's coming out of the pond before you do any treatment to it, then it's not something that would necessarily give you pause. But if it was considerably higher, then you might think about it. So I think the best way to answer that question is, first of all, to take a sample of that and, just analyze it.
Agreed. Yeah.
For
That'd be good.
And then you can kind of take it from there, because you do have those 3 settling ponds, and there's a fair amount of water that's going into the ground every day that, that's recharging the groundwater there. So, I think it's worth asking the question and, taking those measurements.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Great. Any other comments or questions from task force or public? Okay, I'm seeing none. Dana and Scott, do you want to continue with the potential next steps from this thermal study?
So Steve, I'll just jump in again here and maybe Dana can follow me here. Our sense, I think here, given the results of the thermal survey, as well as looking at some of the monitoring results at the Hamilton landfill, which includes a groundwater flow map towards the pond, it certainly strikes me that this is an area that we should focus on a little bit more. So I've asked Dana to prepare a proposal for an additional monitoring well that would be between the landfill and the pond, such that we can do some of the testing that I think you were asking about. We've also, we can move into the related item is, as you recall, we did a field survey of the Lincoln Street well also, and we have a proposal for some monitoring wells there. We could perhaps cover both now, but maybe start with the Gravelly Pond proposal for the task force consideration. And Dan, I don't know, do you have a map showing the well locations, proposed well locations? I can't remember.
For the Gravelly Pond?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward. Let me go ahead and
Yeah.
I'll go back to sharing screen.
Yep, I think that's a fine approach, Scott, unless there's any objection.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dana.
Yeah. Let's see if I can find that. Okay, can you see that graphic that just, or the table I just pulled up?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to first go to the map, and really there's no magic to this. It seems like the best place for a well would be in that cove area where the measurements were taken previously, perhaps not as close to the pond, but closer to the toe of the slope. For those of you that are familiar with these trails, the point that we measured here was near a fairly steep drop off. And then there's a noticeable inlet, which isn't full right now. There might be some time in really high water that it might be full, but it looks like it's, you know, it's a cove, but it's not typically filled with water. And this is kind of a point that's down gradient, that is this Hamilton landfill here is flowing in this direction. So these wells are right down gradient from another pair of monitoring wells that you can see right on Chabaco Road. So what I'm proposing is not just one well, but a pair of wells that are side by side. And the reason for that is when you have a large change in topography from the top of the landfill to a lower point, you can have shallow flow and then deeper flow, which may have two different water quality signatures. And so quite often a pair of wells will give you good information, because you'll get a sense of what a couple of different depths will show you in terms of water quality. They wouldn't be deep wells. The deepest well would be probably about 25 to 30 feet. If that, it would depend on what we run into beneath the land surface. And then the shallow well would be probably in the 10 to 12 foot range. They can be installed with a little impact on the surrounding area, because I'm used to working with drillers that have track rigs that have very little impact and can get just about anywhere that you can imagine. And after these wells are installed, since you're looking at a number of parameters, including PFAS as a possible water quality parameter, what I've put together is a proposal that will look at the typical groundwater or the typical drinking water parameters, with the exception of radon and bacteria, which I don't think is really necessary, and including PFAS, sampling that twice, and then putting together a summary report. So that's kind of the suggestion, in addition to doing the winter survey of the thermal survey to kind of confirm our results. So what I've done is I've asked for quotes from laboratories and drillers, and because PFAS is it's a fairly it's one of those chemicals that it's easy to contaminate samples, so you have to take special measures when you're doing the sampling and so on, and it's an expensive analysis. So the cost looks high, but there is a lot that goes into getting these samples. So this is an estimate for doing that work.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about the Lincoln well, and because there's two possible locations, we can possibly do something that's a little more cost savings by doing them at the same time. So I think if we go over the Lincoln Street proposal, it's basically the same approach and the same cost, because I'm hoping that if you decide to do both, they can be done concurrently.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me hear reactions from task force members to either or both of these proposals. What do you think?
Go for it.
Thank you, Francie.
I guess I have a question just based on the cost of the water sampling. These are things that are being measured, fairly routinely by our DPW. I don't know if Chuck or Nate can comment. Does this seem reasonable for the charge, or should we try to do the laboratory analysis through whatever providers we normally use, and just rely on Dana for the drilling and the analysis?
Good question.
I guess I was withholding comment till I got a chance to review it a little closer, but
Okay.
it generally doesn't seem completely out of line. But I do have kind of, is there a separate piece of paper for proposal for Lincoln that, because this one on the top says Gravelly Pond well, so is the implication that it's 20K times 2, or is it 20K mean we're getting some amount of savings from doing both? I'm a little not sure what direction you're going there, but we can take a closer look at it. I don't know if there's more that I can't see yet or haven't seen.
Yeah. And if you, and basically it's the same price for both each location. And I can provide, a better breakdown here. I just provided this summary table so that I didn't, overwhelm you with numbers.
Yeah, I mean, we're paying roughly, $500 a pop for our PFAS samples. They do take a little bit more, handling care, I guess. But if it were some sort of boon on cost savings, I would definitely, talk to Ben about being able to include those in our monthly sampling. We're doing, we're actually taking 2 samples the Gravelly samples are only quarterly, the Lincoln are monthly, but we're taking 2 samples because we're sending them to 2 different labs for, that end of the QA/QC, because the difference between labs can be, 5 parts per trillion easily.
Right.
So,
And I'm sorry. Yeah. And I'm still just confused. Is it 20,000 for Lincoln Street and Gravelly Pond, or is it 40,000 for Lincoln Street and Gravelly Pond?
It's 40,000 for both.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just jump in here. I do have a map, if you don't, Dana, showing the proposed locations at Lincoln Street, if you want to look at that.
Yeah, go ahead and pull that up, Scott, if you would.
You want to stop sharing for a second, Dana? I can pull that up.
Before we move on to Lincoln Street, I think it would be really valuable to get a little breakdown of those lump sum costs for the drilling and the analysis and the lab work, so that Chuck and Nate can give us a more specific comparison to their costs. And you should probably note whether it's just the big 6, as I think is the case in PFAS testing the town is currently doing, or would it be more comprehensive panel of 30, or I think some of the panels are 60 different PFAS compounds.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely provide that. It's what the DEP, suggested analyses are. So
I think we only report the 60, but I think we do get results for multiple. I don't know the exact number though.
Yeah, I think it's upwards of 30.
Gotcha.
yeah, that's about right.
And Steve, sorry to jump in front here, but I might just ask through you, if I may, to Nate and Chuck. I know we had some discussion about possibly approaching Hamilton to see if we could willing to sample their existing wells for PFAS and other compounds. That would also be a possibility as an interim measure, because a significant part of these costs are installing the new wells, which I do believe is a good idea to have Manchester have their own wells. But certainly, if we were trying to save some money, we do have wells in place at the Hamilton landfill. If the town of Hamilton is willing to sample those, or have us sample those for PFAS, perhaps that's another potential interim cost-saving measure.
Yeah, I haven't broached that with my counterpart in Hamilton yet. I'm trying to think of it from his point of view. I will say, there's no obligation right now to sample PFAS in landfills. We did it at our landfill to answer these questions. But, in the case of Hamilton, there are, private wells within a certain proximity to their landfill. And so it does really open up a can of worms. So I don't know, I want to tread lightly and delicately on that.
Yes, certainly. I want to defer to you on that, Chuck.
Yeah.
Okay, I see, John, you had your hand up. Also, Jeff, we'll take those in order.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Steve. So these wells are fairly close to the gravelly pond. I don't know what the distance is, but they're fairly close. So my question is, how would the answers that you get from the wells differ from the answers that you get in gravelly pond that we've been dealing? I assume that it's diluted out quite a bit in gravelly pond, so you get a better reading, an earlier reading, but that then also brings up the question, so what are we going to do with the answer? You're really close to gravelly pond, and so you know what's coming. Is this like the meteorite that's coming to Earth and you just brace yourself, or is there something we can do about this?
So John, through you, Steve, I can answer that. I can answer the first question better than the second one. They're great questions, John. First question is, the samples you have on gravelly pond simply show that the compounds are there, but you don't know where they're coming from. I think it's a fair assumption. This proposed analysis would really detail where they're coming from, and it builds on our findings of the thermal survey, which suggests that most of the groundwater into gravelly pond is coming from that east side, from the GP1 area. So this would provide more of information on a source area rather than whether or not they are in the pond, which we already know to some extent. Your second question is a huge question and a very good one. Where do we go from there? And I honestly, I've thought about that. I'd rather not get into too much tonight where it could go, because it could go in many directions. But I think, when I was hired to work here, the charge was, where's the water come from and what are the potential sources of contamination? And I think that we're starting to get a better understanding where the water is coming from, and we do have I would say, a probable source that needs to be evaluated. And I think it's worth taking that step. But I think your second question is an important one, and I honestly don't have a definitive answer as to where it goes, because obviously that creates some important questions for the two towns to talk about.
Well, I think we can assume that the work that you're doing, if these wells come up positive, you're looking toward the Hamilton landfill and maybe some other areas there, and say it's coming from there. Can we do something about what those source areas are before it gets too bad? I understand those lead times are probably significant, but still we have some path to deal with that. But I agree. You got to know what you're dealing with before you can figure out how to deal with it.
Yes, I'll jump in a little bit there. So, we do have, we did do the sampling at our own landfill, which is only a stone's throw from the Hamilton landfill. I have no reason to believe that our landfill is any better or worse than Hamilton's. They seem to be pretty much of the contemporary, age and, capped versus uncapped and, all of those things. The results from our own landfill monitoring wells were fairly significant. So I think we could expect something within a range of, plus or minus, pick a number, 50%, at the Hamilton landfill. So, from there, those numbers were definitely higher than the MCL for drinking water, which you would expect. A solid waste facility is a lot different than a drinking water facility. So from there, we have already done this exercise at the Lincoln Street well, which is we can add treatment and we can treat the PFAS. So if there is a appetite of the town or towns to investigate that further, another alternative would be to do a similar exercise for what are the potential treatment options at the gravelly pond facility. So because, and I'll Nate can probably talk to this more than me, but my general impression right now is that solid waste and landfills, first of all, I don't believe they have an MCL, and second of all, I don't know that there's a good way to treat it at the solid waste side of things. So that's why there's been such an emphasis on drinking water facilities, is because it's very easy to treat. And, well, I shouldn't say easy to treat. It's costly, but I guess it is actually kind of easy. But it's costly. So anyway, I guess that's just another way of looking at this, is that, you know, we do have some of these answers, and we can kind of make some conjecture on where we will be going. Now, you know, that there might be more to it than that, but, you know, from a drinking water perspective, I think that is the answer, at least at this point.
These are excellent points. I appreciate, and I'll just note that we would by no means be unique in this situation if we found that both Hamilton's landfill and our own landfill are unfortunately close to our primary drinking water supply and may pose a more significant threat over time. I think that's going to be prevalent probably throughout the United States, but certainly in my experience in New England. Jeff, you're next. Please unmute.
What info would the proposed wells add to the samples that could potentially be collected from the existing Hamilton wells?
Scott? Jana?
I think what it would tell you is, you know, what the I guess trajectory isn't the right word, but where that plume center could be, and is it coming in at the location where we feel like there might be the most groundwater influence. So, for instance, if the wells that are on the Hamilton landfill show that there's a concentration that's fairly high at the center of the landfill, but not to the west or not to the north or the south, that down gradient well will help to tell us where that greatest concentration of whatever constituent you're looking for is coming from. So it would just further define the plume. And is the leading edge, if it's coming, has it arrived at the pond? And, you know, what kind of longevity is there in that groundwater flow path between the landfill and the pond?
Got it. Thank you.
Peter, I see your hand is up, please. Speak.
Yes, I believe that the EPA requirements on the PFOs and PFOAs will be coming out in December. They include discussions on landfills. Right now, they're looking at isolate and contain. Isolate means throw a fence around it. Nobody knows what contain means. Hopefully somebody will come up with a bright idea. And they're probably going to lower the acceptable limits for PFAs in general. I don't know, there's unknown how low it'll go, but I probably won't be lower than what the state is, but it'll be lower than what they have now. So Chuck's suggestion of maybe considering treatment plant at Gravelly Pond may be an omen of things to come, and we may think about that sooner rather than later.
Yeah, many of you may know, if I just break in here, many of you may know that there's an EPA seminar next week on November the 2nd that's going to be going over the proposed concentrations, the new concentration limits that the EPA will be proposing. So they'll give a lot more information on that too. I can send that information to Steve and Sue, and they can distribute it to the group if you're interested.
I think that would be very useful. Thanks, Dana.
Okay.
Gordon, you're next.
Thanks. I guess I would just sort of second the other two comments that were made, that I think the questions about how you act on the data is really important. And I like Jeff's question about, you know, what additional information this gives you. But I just wanted to clarify, Dana, it sounds like our well in and of itself doesn't really tell us what we need to know about a potential plume of contaminants. It really is dependent upon having other sampling sites either very near the Hamilton landfill or in it from those monitoring wells. And so I guess I'm just kind of wondering, should we make sure that Hamilton agrees to working with us to sample those monitoring wells before we pull the trigger on something like this? Or should we consider another well higher up the hill, right across the street or something like that?
Right.
I'm not sure
Yeah.
that's our property, unfortunately, across the street.
Okay.
But
Wow.
you're making the point that I think Chuck has just made in the chat. If you don't mind, Chuck, I'll read your comment. I would be interested in the comparison between the Hamilton wells and the proposed wells. So I think maybe the idea would be to drill the wells in addition to getting permission. So I would second that, as Gordon just has. To
Yeah.
Dana's point, the more specificity you can have about what is the gradient currently, and how could you estimate the delta, the rate of flow. Scott has better words for these, I think, than I do, but
Yeah.
we want to know what kind of impact might we anticipate in the future, and when will it come? Scott?
Yeah, I would just want to, I think what Chuck wrote here is perfect, and exactly my thought, and that is, I totally understand why not hold off drilling this well and just sample the Hamilton wells, but this seems important enough to me, given the grand scheme of things, that the cost of putting this additional well in and really defining this is to the significant advantage to the town of Manchester. I think it's worth approaching Hamilton to see if they're willing to do the sampling, but I think, as I heard, I think from Chuck, I would understand why they might pause on this a little bit, because, where's this going to go? And this could be a period of time before this happens. And, my thinking is, I know it's, in some ways it's a lot of money, but in other ways it's not much money at all to do this. And I will add, most of this money is not going to Dan and I, just to be clear here. This is subcontractors. If we can get the people working for the town now, is it Woodard and Curran, I'm sorry, to do the sampling, that's great. And that might save some money, all for that. But I think what Chuck wrote here is perfect. I think we should.
So I just wanted to clarify then that you
Yep.
think a single well where you're proposing still gives us enough information to know. So if we don't have that data from Hamilton for a while, it's still worth it in your opinion.
Gordon, first of all, it's not. It is a multi.
Well, it's two wells, but yeah.
2 wells.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. I mean, these studies can go on and on and on, but I think
Okay.
where we're at right now would provide a significant amount more data.
Mhm.
If we feel like it's not conclusive, we can always add more wells, but
Mhm.
I think this step would be a significant step to determining whether or not it's getting to the reservoir.
Okay. And I like the idea that you're monitoring a lot of other contaminants as well, too. I think that's really, really valuable as well. Thank you.
Peter, your hand is still up. Was that leftover? Apparently it was. I'd like to turn our attention a little bit. It's over there. It's really on the stem. Sorry, distraction. Turn our attention to Lincoln Street well for a moment.
Steve, if I can share my screen, I'll just quickly show a slide here. Can you see this map? Is that visible?
Yes, yep. It's visible.
Okay, so, and I think I may have showed this at the last meeting, I'm not sure. And these specific locations need to be detailed, but when we did the field walk out there, Steve, you and I and Chuck and Nate, first of all, we talked about the elementary school here on the south side, and there is a stormwater infiltration facility located in this area. So this well would be really for the purpose of monitoring sodium to confirm that, in fact, we're not getting significant applications of sodium chloride there. It is, and by the way, just for orientation, this is the Lincoln Street well right here. This circle is highlighted as the 400-foot radius to zone 1. And the other shaded area that you can kind of barely see is the zone 2, which means the contributing area to the well. So one thought is to put a well in here for the purpose of monitoring salt applications from that area, which is certainly in close proximity to the well. And then we have a second well located over here between the athletic field and the production well, which should provide us information to determine whether or not that synthetic turf is actually a contributor to the PFAS compounds and perhaps other compounds as well. So this is essentially what the proposal is for the Lincoln Street well. And as Dana said, There is some cost savings, even though the costs seem high, there's some cost savings in getting the driller out there to do both sites at the same time. And maybe I'll ask Dana if you want to add anything to what I've said before we open it to questions, because maybe you can add some things.
Yeah, no, I think you've summarized it pretty well. The one thing that occurs to me that we basically repeated the same list of analyses for both locations here in the Lincoln Street area. And if there's no worries about PFAS from the infiltration area here to the south, that would be one thing that could be eliminated from the list. And, you know, we could just take that, do that analysis adjacent to the athletic field. But I think that these two wells would be beneficial to give you good overall information about the water quality that's making its way towards the Lincoln Street well.
Questions or comments about this part of the proposal? Gordon? And then Lynn?
I think Lynn had her hand up first.
Fine. Fire away, Lynn.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm just
I don't
wondering.
have any audio.
No,
Oh.
can you hear me? No.
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. Those turf fields, don't they have a bunch of drainage underneath them? Is there any way you could tap into the drainage that's underneath there rather than doing a well?
I got a lot of schooling in that last night, as it turns out, at Conservation Commission.
I wanted to go to that meeting.
There is varying types of gravel in the base, very extensive feet of gravel, in fact, for infiltration purposes. And then there are some structures to capture water which may not be infiltrating, but they are way below the surface and not subject to any O&M. They're not maintained, as I understand. Couldn't be. So that, short of drilling down there, there's no outflow from, and intentionally, there's the design of those things is that 100% of the water that falls on them, even in the heaviest rains, will go vertically, infiltrate down into the sub-basin into the land. Thank you, Donna. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah.
that's the fact. And
So
while
it's
I'm
not
on the
very
subject,
useful.
I need to inject a little bit of what do you call it, real politics into this, because last night the Conservation Commission voted 4-1 to allow in a more abbreviated application called an RDA the replacement of those turf fields with, excuse me, those turf fields with new material, with a number of assurances and hopefully some tests to back it up that there will be no detectable levels of any of the 30 to 60 primary PFAS, along with more standard toxins before it's put in. But I guess that I mentioned that because it's kind of like it's a variation on John's question about Gravelly Pond, which is if we found that there was PFAS, for example, what would we do? Would we ask the town to tear up the existing turf field, which has just been replaced at the cost of some millions of dollars? Gordon, you're next.
Thanks. Just sort of following up on Lynn's question, it sounded like they said in the earlier meeting at the Conservation Commission that there was some kind of a sump device, maybe not a pump, but a well or something that could be checked on the field. But it's what you're saying is it's not accessible. It's just buried with under the field. So
that's what we were told last night. There is a stormwater system that utilizes the field, but I think it's from upgradient sources like Spy Rock Hill and Summer Street, and is ancient. It this, the turf field by decades.
Okay. You're saying that's underneath there somewhere?
Yeah, and it discharges right into Sawmill Brook.
Okay. I don't, looks like Scott maybe left, but on the map, I guess my question is, if we're going into this mode of putting some wells in, is there any way, or would it make any sense to put a well a little to the right of the southern well? And the reason is I get worried that there's a gas station at the corner, sort of right near where that, where Lincoln Street meets Summer Street. And I'm just wondering, I assume if we put this monitoring well in, it stays there forever and we can go back to it and keep testing it. And so I guess I'm wondering, would it be nice to have an early warning system if something were coming from the gas station down the hill here towards our drinking water? Yeah, right about where your mouse was there a second ago, sort of where the road and the circle meet. Yeah, somewhere in there. I don't know.
Gordon, are you talking about the recovery well at 76 Summer? The old gas
Not
station?
76 Summer. I'm just saying there is a gas station that's active, a service station on the corner of that road where Lincoln
Down
Street,
here.
little lower than
Little
that, where
further
Lincoln
down.
Street meets Summer Street.
So that's 96 Summer Street there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'm not saying they have any problems or anything like that, but it's pretty close to our water supply. And if there were to be a leak or something, I don't know, would monitoring a well somewhere between there and our drinking water supply give us a little bit of an early warning?
Mhm.
Well, Steve, if I may, as I was looking at this map earlier today, thinking about it, I mean, we're starting to circle the well here, circle the production well, and it might make sense to have 2, 3, or 4 wells in various directions for various purposes. I hadn't thought about the gas station, Gordon, but certainly if you had a few wells on the perimeter of this 400-foot radius, that would really provide some pretty good early warning information on other sources as well. So I honestly had not thought about the gas station at all, which I guess is here. Is that right?
Yeah. And the one you have, the blue one that's there in the south right now, that's kind of between the well. If you keep going, if you draw a line between the well and the blue dot you have, and keep going down through the school south, that's sort of where 76 Summer Street is. And that's a known site that leaked in the past. So there's a whole DEP report on that site, sort of, south of the school further. So, so I like keeping the blue one where you have it, but.
And again, this was for the purpose of monitoring sodium relative to the salt. But I think obviously once you get a well in, you can sample it for multiple different parameters.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. It is a nice long-term, early detection system in a sense, because you know that your water is flowing towards your well. You've got a nice zone of influence there.
Mm-hmm. And Lynn has a comment in the chat that there used to be 2 gasoline storage tanks at the ECC, at least based back in the 90s, 1990 report. I don't know if those are still active, but sort of, I guess, supporting this idea that having some sentry wells around from different directions could be helpful. I assume we can't put wells on other people's property, right? We got to stick with our town property.
That was a question I had, maybe for Tom or John Round. What portion of that 400-foot radius that intersects the county club is actually town land leased to the club?
It's the end of the 6th green and all the 7th hole, the 7th tee, the 7th hole, the 7th green, all covered by the easement. So, I mean, you could be within that. Is that a 400-foot circle for zone 2?
Zone 1.
You could be within there and be able to put a monitoring well that's on our property. Now you'd have to check the official easement, but that's a major portion of the 6th green, and all the 7th hole belong to the town of Manchester.
Okay. And Francie has just put a question in the chat. If the schools claim to be using only calcium chloride or something other than sodium chloride, why should we test for sodium at that location?
So Steve, I can provide at least a potential answer to that is that I've heard this calcium chloride solution in many areas. I'm just not certain as to how consistently and long-term that is implemented. So I think this, if we believe it, that's fine, then we don't need to do this, but we're not sure. This is a pretty simple way to check it on occasion to make sure that in fact, that's not a major source.
Good point. And it could actually have a positive effect on the people following through on that claim.
Yes, I think so.
Yep. Okay, other comments?
Yeah, Steve, I've just got a kind of a general comment here.
Go ahead, John.
We're drilling a lot of wells. And I think that one thing that has to come out of the discussion is we have to start to prioritize between the wells we're looking at here, and they all have arguments for them that, you know, in different places, there are different threats that we have to kind of watch for, but I think we have to probably prioritize and decide which one is going to pay off the most for any of a number of reasons. We've got a downstream solution, I suppose, by purifying for PFAS, which cost a pile of money, as I recall from a discussion a couple of months ago. And in some instances, we can do some sort of mitigation in terms of what is the cause upstream, and is there something that we might be able to do there? But I think from all the discussion I've heard here for the past 40 minutes or so, that's the direction we have to go in, because I can't see the town or the Board of Selectmen saying, oh, you want to drill 10 wells, that's what we'll do. I think that we've got to kind of prioritize as to where are the biggest threats, and come up with 1 or 2 or 3 scenarios that would make the most sense for us.
Yeah. John, would you think that the Gravely proposal meets that standard?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yes, I do. I'm looking at some of the wells here, and I'm saying I don't think 4. And I can see that, oh, why don't we put one north, south, east, west or something like that? But, you know, maybe there's one direction that is the biggest concern, or 2, and to kind of put that forth as something that that makes sense. But I just think we have to have some prioritization.
Fair point. Before I forget, another thing that would probably be useful, Dana and Scott, would be to give us the unbundled prices, costs, as well as I assume that the estimates you've given us are assuming that we go ahead with the 2 proposed sites around Lincoln Street and the double header single site.
Sure.
Gravely. Yeah. So what would it look like if we were just to do Gravely by itself?
Right.
Thank you. Jessica.
Yeah, I don't remember what our budget is, and so it's kind of hard to know, like, if these numbers are reasonable amounts or without knowing what our total amount we have to spend is.
We've been allocated $80,000 for this year, and I think we have somewhat more than half of that unallocated and unspent. Is that approximately correct, Sue, or can you be more precise?
That is approximately correct, and no, I cannot be more precise than that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm getting a sense, and I'll invite opinions on this, that the task force is interested in these and would like some more information, more detail in the proposals, so that Chuck and Nate might give us a more specific comparison, and so that we have a little processing time. And I don't know whether there are other hurdles that the turf fields need to passed before they are ripped up, carted away and replaced. Anybody know if the select board needs to bless this, or is it sufficient for it to get a wetlands permit and a vote of the school board? Ann?
The school district controls the Highland Field. And as far as I know, they have the permits that they need, and the select board has no further interest in that. The Coach Ed Field is held jointly between the town and the school district. And at some point, we need to sort out who pays how much for that. And I'm sure that the discussion of the ecological impact will be part of that.
Great, thank you. Reactions to my attempt to summarize the sense here, which is that we're interested in this, but we need more information, and then might make a more intelligent decision. I don't see nodding. I don't see head shaking. I see one nod. Thank you, John. All right. Well,
Peter has his hand up.
Peter, please save us. Take us out of this confusion.
Chuck, I have a question for Chuck or Nate. I know that it's not definitive, but what's the probability of us being able to divert any PFAS infiltration at Lincoln Street well? I mean, if it doesn't matter, if we know where it comes from, if we still have to put the treatment plant in, are we doing more work than we have to, or we just bite the bullet and say, well, when and if we exceed the limit, we have to put the plant in? Or do you think it's possible that we could divert somehow the water from contaminating the well?
Well,
So, yep.
Go ahead, Nate.
Yeah. So I haven't seen anything to date that can effectively, on a large scale, treat in situ PFAS. I know they're working on it, and they're, looking at various different treatment options, but there's nothing out there yet that I've seen that can do that. So I think at this point, with current technology and everything, it's the most effective is to treat it at the point of source. So where we pump it at Lincoln Street well.
Peter, does that answer your question?
If I understand it correctly, right now the best approach, if we have to, is to treat it at the Lincoln Street well rather than going back upstream and trying to somehow minimize the amount that gets to the well. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
I mean, I would just add real quick, I don't know that we have any sort of background. We know that, it's at the well, but like these fields, for instance, we don't know exactly how much of the contributing source of the fields is what we're seeing at the well. And, I've thought a lot about it, and I'll take it one step further. If we say, do not put in turf fields at the schools and at Coach Field, and we say, put in a grass field, theoretically, they're going to water that grass field with water from the well that we know has PFAS in it. And so therefore, you're not really circumventing that issue, especially if you're talking about the health advisory level of 4 parts per quadrillion, let alone the treatment level of 20 parts per trillion. So I guess my answer to all of this is we're not getting away from PFAS in any short time frame. It is here, and it is here to stay. And that's the problem, but it's also, not completely unsolvable. So
no, I guess my point is, are we wasting time trying to determine where it comes from? Just accept that it's coming from someplace and focus on the treatment if we need to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't have to be either or, but it definitely is certainly, any sort of end game has to include treatment at the well or at the plant.
All right, thank you.
Well, I think we've given this one a good toss and shake. So it being 10 after 8, I'm going to ask Scott and Dana, is there anything else you wanted to tell us tonight? If not, we'll thank you as always and see if we can move on in the agenda.
Sounds good. Thank you. And we'll get those detailed numbers to you sometime next week.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Next on the agenda is updates from working groups. So I will open the floor for anyone who has an update. I apologize for not polling people in advance, so anything is fair game here.
John Round, do you want to talk a little bit about the information you sent out?
Yes, I guess I can, Tom. I've been working on a projected pricing structure that would increase some of the upper tier costs, which really only affect the very big volume users, and seeing if increased pricing can somehow lead to conservation and reduction of use of water. And I've got some data, some plots that I think Steve will put together sometime in the next several days, looking at if we were to increase the top 3 tiers. And there are 6 tiers of pricing in Manchester, and the top 3 tiers, only the top couple of hundred houses even get to the top 3 tiers in pricing here in Manchester. But there was I proposed going 2x, 4x, and 8x, the tiers 4, 5, and 6, and then also going 5x, 10x, and 20x, which would be a pretty big increase. And there are a couple of other communities in the country that have done that sort of thing to try and get people to conserve water. I don't know that the articles I've read have said anything about what has happened, but they do have pricing structures where the top tier is orders of magnitude, at least one order of magnitude, if not more than the basic one. So we want to plot that, and then we can kind of discuss how that might make sense. But when we see it on a graph, we're able to say, well, if we get 10% reduction, this is how the money goes down or goes up, and see how that works out. So I think we'll have that for discussion the next time around. And I also did pull together some information on all of the water supply systems for all of the surrounding towns here. And we've spoken about that from time to time in some of our meetings, but have never really put it all in one place. And this information, some of it was in the Duber report, some of it was in on the websites of the various towns. But it appears that in terms of the North Coastal Water Basin, which is where we are, and the only other town, to my knowledge, that is drawing water from the same place that we are, is Essex. All of the other towns, a lot of them are in the Ipswich water basin. I'm not sure where Rockport and Gloucester are, but I think they're in another water basin. I'm waiting, Chuck or Nate, I guess you might be able to comment on that, because I did send this to you with a few pieces of missing data, and that was it.
Yeah, so John, yeah, we definitely owe you some comments back on that. We just haven't been able to get it. But I believe that Gloucester and Rockport are both considered North Coastal Basin, but it's a big basin, and there's probably the sub-basin level. You're correct that, you know, it's only Essex and Manchester. There's no other community. So,
all right.
And I would be very doubtful that Gloucester and Rockport have really much of any influence on us and vice versa. So,
okay, well, it's worth looking into. As you know, anyone who's drawing from the same basin or aquifer, we're all in the same boat together, and we really need to look at that longer term. And I know that Scott Horsley is also looking at if there have been changes in some of the water flow directions around us, and does that bring any of the other communities around us drawing from that basin as well? Like, that information, I guess, is yet to be determined, but right now I guess it's just the 4 of us, and primarily just Essex. So that's information that I guess will be distributed at some point within the next several days or so. So it's kind of a summary.
Great. Thank you, John. That's valuable stuff to build those scenarios and look at the break-evens.
Yes.
While we await some more facts and data from from Scott's grad student project. Anything from our friends on contaminants? I know you guys have been active, but I don't know if you've had a chance to meet.
Yeah, we did. We had one meeting since the last meeting, actually last night, and we're just working on a draft document. So it was a fairly productive working meeting, talking about the possible sources that we've talked about, just trying to document all that. And the hope is we'll get that to this full team to look at as soon as that's ready. And it's nice to hear about all the potential wells and things like that proposed tonight. I think that addresses a lot of the questions that our committee has been working on. I don't know, anybody else on the team have other questions or comments you want to add?
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
Thanks, Jessica. There was one other issue under the heading of contamination that Francie raised in the last few days. And I wonder, it's saltwater intrusion. I wonder, Francie, if you could just give us a précis of your thoughts about that. Maybe Scott will share his reactions.
Well, I was just consulting Scott and also Chuck about a long-term question with sea level rise, whether saltwater intrusion could occur in the aquifer around the well, and perhaps Scott could give his opinion based on a lot of data he was kind enough to look at.
Sure. Steve, I can just show my screen one more time for one
Please
last
do.
slide,
Yep.
and I'll be brief here. Can you see this graphic here, this cross section? Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay,
see it.
thank you. So I spoke with Francine today, and this question about saltwater intrusion is a big one, especially globally. I've done work on this, certainly on the Cape and the islands. I've done this work on Guam and Hawaii. And basically, it's a good question, and I'm glad you brought it up. But one of the ways to answer it is this so-called Geibman-Herzberg relation, and I'll briefly explain this. What happens in coastal settings such as Manchester is, as you can see in this cross section, underneath the ocean, this says salt water here, but it's actually salt groundwater because it's beneath the so-called seafloor. And then underneath the land, we have this says fresh water, but really this is fresh groundwater. And what happens is you have this what's called a wedge or lens of fresh water that actually at this point of the ocean interface actually floats up on salt water. And the reason for that is that fresh water is less dense than salt groundwater. And there's this Geibman-Herzberg relationship, as it says here, suggests that for every foot of water table you have above mean sea level, which is represented by this H right here, you have 40 feet of depth to that saltwater interface. So Francie and I looked at the Lincoln Street well, and working from my memory here, the water table in that area is around 12 feet above mean sea level. If you multiply it times 40, that would suggest that the saltwater interface would somewhere around 480, 500 feet beneath sea level. The Lincoln Street well is about 50 feet in depth, and it probably does draw water from beneath it, which is referred to as upconing. So there might be another 25, 30, 40 feet. There's water pulled up beneath the well, below the 50 feet. But my quick reaction to the question, which again, I think is a great question, is that there's probably adequate depth of the aquifer such that saltwater intrusion would not be a threat to that well. So based upon this information, which is pretty widely held, that would not be a threat. However, I did suggest that one thing we could do without a lot of work would be to look at these sodium levels at the Lincoln Street well plotted against the pumping rates of that well on those dates where the sodium was measured, because if in fact the highest sodium levels are correlated with the highest pumping rates, it is possible that some upconing of salt water beneath it could in fact contribute. I don't think that'll be the case, but that's something we could do. And then the last comment I would make is this graph I'm showing you is obviously a generalized and idealized situation, although it is been widely used globally to look at these issues. But remember that the Lincoln Street well is at least semi-confined. You'll see up here in the description, it says that this correlation is referred to for unconfined aquifers. The fact that the Lincoln Street well has this clay layer over it and parts of it make it at least what we call semi-confined, which means that it may not follow exactly to these generalized situations. So I think I hope that's more helpful than confusing, but I would say that my first reaction again would be that this is not a source of sodium or problem, but certainly it's a good question, and we could look into it a little bit further by doing that correlation. And I'll stop there and see if there are questions.
Thank you, Scott. Ann, did you have your hand up?
I did, and I was going to ask Scott, and he covered it pretty well, whether the geology of the area affected this graph, which suggests a sand layer going into the water, whereas we have a substantial rock barrier between the well and the salt water.
Yes, I agree. That makes it a little more difficult to generalize. You also, that in addition to the clay layer I referred to, make it a little bit more unique, but yes.
So basically, this chart that you show is kind of a worst case, and we are in a somewhat better geological situation.
That I'm not sure about. I need to think more about how the confining layer might affect things here, but possibly.
Thank you.
Spoken like a true scientist. Thank you. One and all. And now we can all go home and tell our respective partners and children about see if I get this right. You took it off the screen. The Guyben-Herzberg.
Guyben-Herzberg.
Thank you. Guyben-Herzberg. Got it. That plus tuberculation have now entered my vocabulary briefly. There'll be a quiz at the end of the meeting. All right. If there are no other updates, let us move to reviewing and approving with amendments if necessary the minutes from October 5th. Are there any corrections or additions to those minutes? Hearing none, I'll ask for a motion to approve them.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Keough. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. May I have a show of hands or thumbs digitally? Excellent. I see no negatives. So if you have a negative, you have 5 more seconds to utter it. We'll call it unanimous. Helen, your hand is up, and I forgive me if I
Yes.
missed you earlier. What's up? You can go ahead and speak up, please.
He's telling you to speak up. No, I just wanted to vote yes on the minutes.
Oh, gotcha. That was a vote yes. Thank you. I heartily approve. Which brings us to the important task of setting our next meeting date, which, if we follow our routine, will be 3 weeks hence. Who's the fastest to get to a calendar here? That would be
16th.
the 16th of November, Wednesday, comfortably after Election Day. And when is the special town meetings, the 14th?
Town meeting is the 14th. Yep.
Right. So we'll be in recovery from various electoral processes. Any objection to 7 p.m. Wednesday, November 16 date? Hearing none, that will be our next session. Is there anything else that we should consider that did not make it to our agenda?
Steve, I just wanted to throw out there the fact that Greg had mentioned that he would like an update from the task force at a select board meeting. And I was going to throw out the date of December 5th.
Right, thank you. And the select board meets Mondays only?
Yep. Yep.
I may be asking one or two people to sub for me because I've made a commitment for Monday nights through mid-December.
Okay.
But that date should be good one way or another, I'm certain. Some very capable people can make that update for us.
Okay,
So-
so I'll get us on the agenda and you can let me know who's going to be there.
Yep, book it, Sue, and we will provide the cast of characters shortly.
Excellent, thanks.
Thanks. All right, if there are no other matters, Scott,
Steve,
oh, sorry, Ron. Yes, there was one. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Ron Mastrogiacomo. For those who don't know me, I'm liaison to the planning board on the committee. Just wanted to let everyone know before our next meeting, there'll be a special town meeting on November 14th, of which we'll be considering several zoning bylaw changes that the planning board has been working on for more than 3 years. There are a lot of changes, most of them with clarification and updating a number of provisions and strengthening a lot of oversight. But these bylaw changes are consistent with the town input we got from the master plan process. And they were developed by the planning board with help from a zoning expert. They don't increase density or make all zones multi-zones, just contrary to what you might be hearing. But there are several items that are particular interest to the mission of this group. In Article 5, you'll find that there'll be stronger stormwater management rules in response to Chuck Dam's request to align our stormwater regs with state requirements. We'll be moving the stormwater regs to the general bylaws where they'll have broader applicability, and they'll apply to all work, not just building permits or special permits. There'll be stronger special permit review rules, including using performance standards rather than prescriptive standards. By that, the environmental outcome that would be expected, not the means. So that would be in contrast to our old standards. So all of these proposals are found on the zoning link on the town website. And I also posted in the chat, I believe, which will work, the link to these updates. And I appreciate the time and hopefully can get your support on the 14th. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron, in particular for pointing out the relevant parts that reflect the contribution from your work to protecting water supply. I think that concludes things for tonight. So may I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Jessica. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ann. So unless someone objects in the next few seconds, I will consider that approved unanimously. And I will see you all on November 16th. Don't forget to vote.
Twice.
Twice.
Come to town meeting.
Yes, vote early, vote often.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
All right, thank you.